The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Eddison. So, the fantasy genre and I don't necessarily have the greatest of relationships. It is not a genre that I find myself reading all that much of because there really hasn't been all that much fantasy which has really captivated me in the past. I will say that I am a pretty big fan of Stephen King's Dark Tower series. That is some real kick ass fantasy literature, I'll say. But by and large, there hasn't really been all that much fantasy that has resonated with me particularly strongly. However, I will say that I think The Worm Ouroboros may be an exception to the rule because it is quite distinct from any fantasy that I've read before. And what's more, I'm willing to bet that it's probably quite distinct from any fantasy that you've read either. And I think that's probably a big reason why I'm not overly fond of the fantasy genre because so much of it strikes me as being kind of similar, which is ironic because the word fantasy really kind of connotes like imagination, right? And yet, so much of it strikes me as just being kind of color by numbers at times. And that is, of course, because the fantasy genre exists so utterly and so completely in the shadow of Tolkien. But I think that's why the Worm Ouroboros really struck me so, is because it does not abide by that template. Because I think The Lord of the Rings is kind of like a double edged sword. It's an incredibly ambitious and rich and laudable and respectable work, but it also had the unfortunate effect of kind of, like I say, laying a template that subsequent authors would tend to follow, however closely or loosely. Like you get some works like The Sword of Shannara that just blatantly rips it off, and then you also have works such as George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, which is kind of marketed as like a subversion of Lord of the Rings. Like it's like Lord of the Rings, only darker and edgier and more cynical, and also more morally gray. And I think that just goes to show just what a firm grasp Tolkien still exerts on the fantasy genre when works are marketed as kind of being again a subversion of Lord of the Rings. Even though I think to take away that purity of perspective of the Lord of the Rings is kind of taking away the best aspect of it. But I'm getting off topic here. The Worm Ouroboros actually predates Lord of the Rings, I think, by like 30 or so years. So again, it does not follow any template that Tolkien laid, and as a result, it is much different than the fantasy that I've read. And I'm going to tell you all about it. But first, I want to say here that there's a spoiler alert for The Worm Ouroboros because much of the most important things that I want to comment upon and discuss about this book have to do with the way that it concludes, the way that it ends. So I'm going to have to spoil that ending. So be warned, if you don't want The Worm Ouroboros spoiled for you, then leave now. But if you don't mind that, then by all means join me as I take a deep dive into E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros. So, E.R. Edison was an English civil servant in the early 1900s. He was actually an acquaintance of Tolkien. I think he was even like a part-time inkling along with Tolkien and like C.S. Lewis and such. But he is best remembered, I think, for this book, The Worm Ouroboros. And even though he was acquainted with Tolkien, and even though Tolkien spoke highly of E.R. Edison's literary abilities, he did not speak very highly of his philosophy, and that really has a lot to do with some of the things I want to say about this book, because this book is radically different in perspective than The Lord of the Rings, but I'm going to talk about that. So, what is the actual story of The Worm Ouroboros? So it opens with a frame story, a very odd frame story because it is completely abandoned shortly after the book begins, but it opens with a man named Lessingham, who is presumably an Englishman as well, who is transported to the planet Mercury. That's right, this story takes place on the planet Mercury, a very, very, very scientifically inaccurate planet Mercury. So it kind of has a slight element, I guess, of like science fiction to it, I guess, but really it's pretty much pure fantasy. But anyway, so Lessingham goes to the planet Mercury, but you don't have to worry about Lessingham because, again, like I said, shortly after the book, the real story proper commences. The frame story is just completely dropped, and so it begs the question, why was that even in there at all? Don't know, but anyway, the real story, the real heart of the Worm Ouroboros has to do with the war between the lands on Mercury of Witchland and Demonland. And one thing you're going to note about this book is that the names of the countries, as well as the names of the characters, are kind of ridiculous and kind of oddly childlike. And as I'm given to understand it, E.R. Eddison actually came up with the story for this book when he was like a little kid, and that's why the countries in this world, in the world of this book, are called like Witchland and Demonland and Impland and Pixieland and Goblinland. Like it's very kind of childish in the nomenclature. But anyway, this book is not very concerned with world building, and that is something that you might note also as a distinction from like the Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings is a very, very rich and richly detailed work where the histories of all these places and peoples are fleshed out, and like it feels like you're stepping into a world that truly like has existed before you ever entered it. Not so much with the Worm Ouroboros. There isn't much in the way of backstory or lore. All we know for certain is that there was a big war between the lands of Witchland and Demonland and Impland and all the other lands against this land called Ghoul Land, or these people called the Ghouls, who were bad people, and they got wiped out, it sounds like justifiably. But now, as the story opens, an ambassador has come to Demonland from the realm of Witchland, demanding obeisance from the Demonlanders. Now, the demons in the book, and that's what they're called, the demons, are the heroes of the book, and as far as I can tell, they look entirely human, except they have horns, like Hellboy kind of horns that grow out of their heads. But other than that, they're just humans, but they're from the land of Demonland. So anyway, the demons are the good guys, though. They are heroic warrior people. And they do not take kindly to being, they do not take kindly to this demand for submission from Witchland. And Witchland is headed by King Gorus. And what's interesting about King Gorus is that he is like immortal. Every time he dies, he gets like reincarnated into another body. So really there's only like one king of Witchland throughout the ages. Gorus 1 to like 12, I think. Anyway, so they're like, nah, you can tell the Demonlanders, the demons are like, you can tell King Gorus to go shove it. So they make him a counter offer that if their greatest wrestler, who is the Lord Goldry Bluzko. Again, the names in this book are just kind of ridiculous. A lot of the characters in this book don't even sound like they're in the same story. But Lord Goldry Bluzko is going to wrestle King Gorus of Witchland, and if he can beat him in a wrestling match, then the Witchlanders have to say, they have to go home, and they'll say, we leave Demonland in peace. But if Goldry loses, then they can commence an onslaught. So anyway, Gorus, the king of Witchland, and Lord Goldry Bluzko, one of the lords of Demonland, they wrestle. King Gorus cheats, but then Goldry actually kills King Gorus, or this incarnation of King Gorus. So they're like, it's all good. The rules were met. Y'all got to leave. We wrestled, so y'all have to leave us alone. But then, wouldn't you know it, those nefarious Witchlanders just break the oath, and so they break the truce, and so they attack Witchland. And so the whole story basically is just concerned with the war between Demonland and Witchland. Lots of deeds of daring do in here, lots of kind of giant Braveheart style battles. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's the story. It's kind of a war story between these two nations. But now we're going to come to what I have to spoil to really kind of get to the most intensive commentary on this book, and that has to do with the way it ends. So at the end of the book, the demons overthrow the witches, and they not only take back their country, but they make an offensive against Witchland. And King Gorus dies after casting some kind of disastrous spell incorrectly. And basically, Demonland is victorious. They are basically the superpower of this world now. They have no further foes. But at the end of the book, they realize that their lives now have no purpose, apparently, because they have no one left to fight. They are not swords into plowshares kind of people, and so they pray to the gods um, that things can revert to the way that they were, so that their lives can have meaning and purpose again. Um, Through conflict, because apparently that's the only way that these people can, feel good about themselves, as if they're fighting. So anyway, and then at the very end of the book, the gods, I guess, reset the clock, kind of. They alter things so that the book ends, if essentially where it began, with an emissary from Witchland coming to Demonland to demand submission. So um, it comes full circle, and it basically is like a circular narrative. And that is, of course, what the title means, the worm Ouroboros. And Ouroboros, is a very, very ancient symbol of a snake biting its own tail. Um, it is used to symbolize eternity and rebirth, as well as kind of cycles and such. And also, I think it can also be used to denote the concept of futility. But anyway, so King Gorus of Witchland in the Worm Ouroboros wears a little signet ring with the Ouroboros symbol on it. Um, but you don't really understand what the full import of the title is until you get to the end, and you realize that it truly is a forever war. that the conflict just kind of restarts, and so it's all just kind of a cycle. And so yeah, that brings me to um, what I really wanted to kind of touch upon regarding this book, and that is the mindset behind it. So I said that E.R. Eddison and Tolkien, while they respected each other literarily, they had radically different mentalities, and that is because Tolkien's work, as well as C.S. Lewis's work, like Narnia and Lord of the Rings, those are um, uh, either explicitly or at the very least implicitly Christian works. They have very, very Christian sensibilities at their heart, but the Worm Ouroboros does not. This is a very, very pagan work. In particular, it is very, very Norse. It's basically like Norse warrior culture, tempered with a little bit of medieval English chivalry. But this is kind of something that I found highly objectionable about this book, and that is the philosophy behind it. And Tolkien had the same objections to it that I did, I think, that it just openly glorifies war and carnage as the only means for attaining any kind of glory, and really the only purpose in life is to fight Violence is just the highest honor that you can attain in life. And yeah, I just thought that was a bunch of bullshit. Really, I did. Now you may say it's just a fantasy novel. Why are you reading into it this heavily? Well, it is not just a fantasy novel. It is a fantasy novel written with a driving philosophical perspective behind it, which its author, to the best of my knowledge, as I'm given to understand it, fully endorsed. He was really interested in like Vikings and crap like that, and like ancient warrior cultures who just lived and died by the sword for the sake of glory and violence alone. And that's what this book is driven by. That is the mentality behind it. Is just war for war's sake, and there's no other point in life. There's no other glory except in violence and deeds of carnage and battle. Which again, I just thought that was just some bullshit. And honestly, I would be really, really, really curious to know whether E.R. Edison fought in World War One, whether he saw combat, because Tolkien damn sure did. And war is not portrayed in The Lord of the Rings as some kind of boy's adventure like it is in this book. No, it's portrayed as something very, very lamentable, as it should be. But E.R. Edison apparently thought that war was just a jolly good time because that's what the Lords of Demonland do at the end of this book. And like it just boggles my mind how you can spend hundreds of pages describing the things that you do in this book of people getting disemboweled and decapitated and having their limbs cut off, not to mention all the women that get raped apparently in this implicitly. And then at the end, the heroes are like, let's do it again. That was fun. It's just stupid. It really is. Like, I don't know whether the mindset behind this book is uh, whether it's naive or just flat out despicable. I would say at best it's naive, at worst it's despicable because like the war between Witchland and Demonland is this bloody, drawn out conflict where just oodles of people lose their lives, and also just lots of the Demonland women get raped and stuff. It's kind of edgier than Lord of the Rings, I should say that. It's definitely more violent, but also there's it doesn't shy away from sexual matters as much because sex does not exist at all in Lord of the Rings. Women barely exist in Lord of the Rings. They're kind of distant objects of worship, but not so much in this. This book isn't afraid to get nitty gritty and dirty. But after all the carnage and bloodshed and violence and sexual violence that is described in this book, our illustrious heroes are like, hell yeah, let's give it another go. Let's go right back around. Let's start this right over and do it again. And again, it's just such a stupid mentality, or if not stupid, just despicable. And again, I would be very curious to know if E.R. Edison actually saw combat or if he even served in World War One, because I don't know how you could see that and then still think that war is like this grand thing to be extolled. Like I highly doubt that anyone lying in no man's land, gasping out their last breath as the rats come to gnaw on their exposed innards, are probably going to say, "Man, I'm so glad I signed up for this." No, so I think this is pretty clearly a product of somebody who was comfortable writing this from a safe remove from war, where you can kind of idealize war, someone who by an idealization of war by someone who hasn't probably experienced it. But anyway, yeah, I just found it highly objectionable what the ultimate like perspective behind this book was. But I will say this: as much as I disagreed with it, it does give the Worm Ouroboros an added layer of depth. So it's not just a fantasy story; it's actually um, it has some real literary value to it. I think it definitely has a message to it, even though I think that message is questionable at best. But now let's talk about the technical aspects of this book. Now that I've talked about the plot and the driving ideology behind the plot. So the writing in the Worm Ouroboros is far and away its most striking feature. This truly reads like very little else out there, and nothing else out there from this or any later era, I would say. Um, because it's written in a very, very archaic style. It's like an emulation of older, like Jacobean prose works. Like it reads kind of like an Arthurian romance. And when I went into this book, I was kind of worried about that because I had heard that it's written in such a manner. And I was kind of like, I'm anticipating it kind of being gimmicky. It's going to throw in some these and thous, maybe a forsooth or two, and say it like written in an older style. But oh no, E.R. Eddison went all in with the prose style of this book. It truly does read like something from the Middle Ages. It really does. In fact, there are some passages in this book that were genuinely kind of perplexing, hard to read, hard to figure out because it's written so differently from what you're probably familiar with reading. But the writing is its strongest feature. It is. It is truly kind of a thing unto itself. It reads differently than any fantasy that I've read, and I have to say, some of it is downright gorgeous to read. It is a remarkably written book. No real complaints there, except some of it was kind of hard to understand because of the manner of its writing. But now let's talk about the characters. So the characters in this were good enough. It's weird that the villains in the Worm Ouroboros are actually more fleshed out than the heroes. The heroes of the book, the Lords Juss and Spitfire and Goldry Bluzko and Brandok Deha, those are kind of the main characters from Demonland. They're basically just generic good guys. They have high honor and integrity, but they don't really have the most multifaceted personalities. And oddly, E.R. Eddison doesn't really go that much in depth as to kind of fleshing them out as much as he does in the villains. King Gorus of Witchland is a really good villain. He is very, very power hungry. And he will stop at nothing to basically conquer the world. It's kind of like a Saturday morning cartoon villain. But it works. It works well. It is exactly what this story needed, that kind of villain. But even he has kind of a memorable personality. But the real standout character in this book is the Lord Grow, who is a traitorous goblin from Goblin Land who switches sides to the Witchlanders before the start of the book and then switches sides to the Demonlanders later on in the book and then ends not even sure probably himself which side he's on. But that is definitely the most memorable character in this. And honestly, there's a passage in this book where it discusses his motivations, his perspective on things, and that is truly like the most sublime passage in the book is that part right there. So overall, the characters, on the whole, maybe aren't the deepest that I've ever read, but they're good enough for this story. In fact, some of them are more than good enough. So, not too much to complain about with characters there. And yeah, the story it moves at a good pace, but I will say this: there are kind of some gaps in this story. I think, like part of the story is like a rescue mission where the Lords Juss and Brandok Deha try to rescue Goldry Bluzko from magical imprisonment. And the other half of the story is kind of like the war story as Lord Spitfire and the other Demonlanders are trying to hold the line against the onslaught of the witches. Um, and the way like I said, there are kind of gaps in the story at times because certain characters like vanish for a while, then they just kind of show up later with entire armies behind them, and it's like, where did they come from? How did they get back? where did all these other, you know, soldiers come from? It kind of, there are, I think, some gaps in the story that could have been filled in a little bit better, but overall it moves well enough. It's not too slow. It's also, again, quite beautifully rendered, and it is very, very engaging. I was really hooked reading this. It really sucked me in. So to rate The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Eddison, I'm going to give The Worm Ouroboros an A minus. I'm going to knock off a little because I think there were certain aspects of the plot which could have been done a little bit better. I still don't have a clue what the point of including the initial frame story was, because it's just completely abandoned after a point. And also, I'm going to knock some points off because of the message of the book, the philosophy driving it, which I think is, once again, at best naive, at worst despicable. But I will admit that even though I disagree quite strongly with E.R. Eddison as regards his um, outlook on things, it does give the Worm Ouroboros, again, another layer of depth that it might otherwise not have had. And I think it has real literary value to it. This is not just a work of fantasy. I think it's a work of literary fantasy at that. So yeah, I think A minus is a pretty good rating. That's where I'm feeling. So, have you read The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Eddison? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I've said here today. And if you haven't read The Worm Ouroboros, I could recommend this. I really could. It is a truly remarkable work. However, I would advise you, if you do want to read this, maybe don't get this edition that I did. This is a very, very cheap print on demand version, because this book is in the public domain by now. Anybody can print it if they want. And this version here is a print on demand version. But one thing you'll notice is that it doesn't look like a very long book if you just judge by the page count here. But if you get like a professionally printed version of this book, it's much, much longer. And that's because this version here crams as many words onto the page as it possibly can. Microscopic print, again, just so many words crammed on here, and also it's just riddled with typos and mistakes. I mean, just about every other sentence in this had a mistake in it. So yeah, if you do want to read this, maybe don't get this edition that I have. Don't be cheap like I was, I guess. But I could recommend it because it is a very singular and very striking work, and one that is driven by a certain mentality, which I couldn't really agree with, but I could respect the fact that it was driven by something, and then that it gives it a greater depth. And really, you know, at the end of the day, it is a rousing adventure, and one that, like I say, I could recommend. So, as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.